Welcome to Mr. Mills's table saw safety demonstration. Before viewing this demonstration, you should have an understanding of the general shop rules and safety procedures for working in the wood shop. Just a quick note, there are some arrows and pictures in this video that blink. So if you have an issue with blinking or flashing pictures, please avoid this video. This is the SawStop table saw. This model is their cabinet model. It has a 52-inch fence for wide cuts. This is what the saws look like that are in our cabinet shop, but just know that there are other styles of table saws that may look slightly different than this, but the operational procedures would be the same. Even though this is a SawStop model, we are going to instruct you how to use the table saw as if it did not have the safety equipment that comes on this saw. We want you to be able to use any table saw available to you, even if it doesn't have the special safety features. Before using any tool or machine in the shop, you should read and understand the owner's manual before using. The owner's manuals can all be found on my website. Before each use, you should find and read the warning label associated with the machine. This will help get you in the right frame of mind before using the saw, and will be a refresher for the basic safety rules and procedures for using this machine. In my opinion, the table saw is one of the most dangerous tools in the shop. Several potential hazards. You could get kickback, you could get your fingers in the blade, or a variety of other things could go wrong. If you follow the instructions in this video, as well as reading and understanding the owner's manual or operator's manual, then you should be confident in knowing that you can use this machine safely. You should not be scared to use this machine, but you definitely should respect this machine and know that it could very easily cause you bodily harm. Alright, as we're at the table saw to use this, it's very important that we have a nice straight edge on our board. So you need to have used the jointer before coming to the table saw so we have a nice straight edge against the fence. Now our material comes in surfaced two sides. That means the two faces are surfaced, but the two edges are not. So here's an edge that has not been jointed. You can see it's really rough. It's got the rough factory edge on it still. And this side has been run through the joiner, and it's fairly smooth to the touch and even. So that's what you're looking for. A nice smooth edge, straight edge. If you look down the board, it should be pretty straight as you look down the edge, and nice and cleaned up. Get rid of that rough factory edge. To help with dust management in the shop, we want to make sure the machine is hooked up to the dust system and that the blast gate is open to the machine. This will ensure that all the fine powdery dust will get sucked up and collected. There are a few PPE items or personal protective equipment items that will be needed for this machine. First, we have our safety glasses, which should always be worn in the shop. Next, we have our push stick. A push stick is a narrow piece of wood or plastic that can be used to push materials through the blade to keep your fingers or hands a safe distance from the blade. The push block is typically used on the top surface of the material to push the material down tight to the table of the machine. The push block usually has some kind of grip on the bottom so that you can push forward while putting pressure down on your workpiece. A push shoe is similar to a push block but is typically longer and has a notch on the back side so that when you're pushing your material through, this notch will lock on the back edge so that you do not lose grip on the board. We have a few commonly used accessories for the table saw. We have a feather board, and a feather board can be used to keep pressure against the wood so that it stays tight against the fence. It could also be used on the top surface of the wood to keep the wood tight against the table. We could also use a miter gauge on the table saw. A miter gauge allows us to cut angles, including 90-degree angles. A miter gauge becomes necessary when you are cutting material that is wider than it is long. We'll cover this more in detail at a later time. As with many of the machines in the shop, the minimum length to be cut on the table saw is 12 inches. If it is shorter than 12 inches, it is not safe to cut on the machine. There is no minimum width for cutting on the table saw, but you must have the guard in place at all times when cutting. When the saw blade is installed correctly on the table saw, the teeth should be pointed towards the operator on the top side of the blade. If we take a closer look at the blade, you'll notice that the carbide tooth of the blade is slightly bigger than the body of the blade. So as the saw cuts, there's a little bit of room on each side of the blade so that the body of the blade does not touch the workpiece. The kerf, or the thickness of the blade, is represented in this picture. The saw blade is actually removing some of the material. So if you had a board that was 4 inches wide, you could not cut it into two 2-inch pieces because of the thickness or the kerf of the blade. Typically, the kerf on a circular saw blade is about 1/8 of an inch wide. When using the table saw, we have the potential of getting kickback on the table saw. This is when a piece of wood would come flying back towards the operator from the machine. This is typically caused because the material has either moved away from the fence and bound between the fence and the blade, causing extra pressure to be put on the wood and the saw to shoot it back. Another way we can get kickback is when the front of the blade and the back of the blade touch the workpiece at the same time. This binds the blade and can also cause kickback. The board is usually thrown back with a lot of force and can even be violent. Please do everything in your power to prevent kickback. There are several different types of guards available for table saws. It doesn't matter which type of guard you have, you need to keep the guards in place at all times. If for any reason you need to make a cut where the guard needs to be removed, then you need to have your instructor make the cut for you. The traditional style blade guard mounts to the saw underneath the tabletop and is the guard that would be used for most types of cuts. Since the traditional style blade guard comes through the table, it cannot be used when making dado or rabbet cuts using a dado blade. When using a dado blade on the table saw, you would want to have a floating type guard, because when cutting dados or rabbets, you will not be cutting all the way through the material. There are a few main parts of the guard you should be familiar with. First, we have the clear plastic part that guards the saw blade. This is known as the blade guard. Then we have the silver part. The silver part that holds the blade guard to the machine is known as a splitter. The splitter is designed to keep the wood from warping back together and pinching the saw blade as it gets cut. If the wood pinches or binds the blade, it is a potential for kickback. The other part you need to be familiar with is attached to the splitter. It is anti-kickback knives. These have little spikes or spurs on them that make it so if the board were to kick back or shoot back, that in theory these knives would grab or catch the piece of wood, preventing it from shooting back. Anytime our hands are closer than 4 inches to the blade, this might include removing the saw blade, changing the saw blade, or even removing the guard. You should disconnect the power to the machine. There are a couple ways to disconnect the power to the machine. The first way we're going to look at disconnecting the power from the machine is with the main power switch. This is located on the left side of the machine when standing in the operator's position. This is where you can lock out and tag out a machine for maintenance. All you need to do is quarter turn the red knob and it will be disengaged from the power. Another option for removing power to the machine is to unplug the machine. Some machines might be hardwired in and cannot be unplugged. If you choose to unplug the machine, put the plug in somewhere close to you so you can keep an eye on it so nobody accidentally plugs it in while your hands are near the blade. If the cord is long enough, you could even put it in your pocket. When in the wood shop, the guard should be in place at all times when you're cutting. If there's a time that arises where you need to have the guard removed for small cuts, then you need to have your instructor make those cuts for you. Your instructor may ask for you to take off the guard or reinstall the guard to speed up the time in the classroom. Just know that not all table saws guards remove in this process. Some may have a bolt or a nut that needs to be loosened under the tabletop. But for in our shop, this is what it's going to look like. To remove the guard, you're going to lift up on the guard. You're going to locate the little indent and pull up on the little metal bracket for the throat plate. And the throat plate should back out and up. And inside the machine, there's a handle. You're going to lift up on that handle, and then the guard should come out. Then you need to put the handle down back below the table. Reinsert the throat plate by sliding it forward and down and making sure it's flush all the way around, that the edges are not sticking up, and then lock it in place with that lever. To reinstall the guard, we're going to remove the throat plate by lifting up on the locking lever. We are going to lift up the handle inside the machine so that the guard can fit in that gap. We're going to take our guard and we're going to hold back both sets of kickback knives, one on each side. Hold them back, and we're going to slide this in to the machine, locking the handle down. You're going to continue to hold on to those kickback knives so that they stay above the table. And we're going to slide the throat plate back in, making sure it's flush all the way around, and then locking it in place with the handle. Then you can lower the guard back in place, and you're... Before using the table saw, we need to make sure the blade height is set to a safe and acceptable level. The blade should stick up about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece. As a visual reference, that's about the height of the carbide cutting tooth to the bottom of the tooth opening on the blade body. The reason we want to stick to 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece is that so there is not a massive amount of blade exposed if anything were to go wrong. Before using the saw, there's a few things you need to be familiar with from the operator's position. The first is the handle or wheel to the right side of the on-off box. This wheel is what raises and lowers the blade. There's also a wheel on the left side of the power box, which is also on the left side of the machine. This wheel is for tilting the blade to different angles. There are two different ways in holding your workpiece on the table. The first we're going to talk about is a board that is wider than it is long. This does not refer to the grain of the wood, but the actual size of the board. If you look at this first picture, the board is longer from right to left than it is from front to back. So when we look at this material is going to have very little surface area along the fence. This long stick is going to be able to have a lot of leverage applied to it, so any movement of the board is going to be multiplied along the fence, and you're going to have a higher rate of kickback occurring. The only safe way to cut a board that is wider than it is long would be to use a miter gauge and a stop block or a sled of some kind on the table saw to help support this wide material. The second way we could hold our workpiece on the table is in this second picture where the board is now longer than it is wide. You can see that this would give you a lot more surface area for the material to be tight against the fence. This is the kind of cuts we want to make on the table saw. The miter gauge is one of the accessories for the table saw that we talked about earlier in this video. The miter gauge can be helpful when cutting boards that are wider than they are long. You typically do not want to use a fence and the miter gauge at the same time. If you need to set a stop so that you can cut multiple pieces, then you would set a stop block between the fence and your workpiece so that no material was dragging on the fence while using the miter gauge. If we were to use the miter gauge and the fence at the same time, my board is going to drag and have friction along the fence as I'm pushing this through, and it could cause it to move away from the miter gauge and bind in the blade. So what we'd want to use is a stop block and a clamp, and we would attach that to the fence, and we would want to make sure that the stop block is set behind the blade. So if we come over here and look, the stop block is not up here in line with the blade. That way we can butt up our workpiece, make our cut, and have nothing dragging as we're going past the blade. It's nice and free, nothing's going to bind or catch on us as we're going through the saw blade. When you are getting ready to cut narrow stock, it's a good idea to get your push stick ready and have it sitting on top of the fence or just to the other side of the fence. This will give you easy access to the push stick when you're using the machine. When using a push stick to rip narrow stock, the placement of the push stick is important. If we put the push stick near the blade without hitting the guard, this will help us keep the board tight to the fence. If we put the push stick tight to the fence, it's going to want to push the board towards the blade, causing the other end of the material to come away from the fence. This could cause the wood to bind or pinch the blade, which would end up causing kickback. You always want the push stick to be as close to the blade as possible without hitting the blade or the guard. When using the push stick, we need to pay attention to the end of the push stick, and we need to keep that notch directly on our workpiece. This will help ensure that we're holding the push stick at the correct angle. If we hold the push stick too parallel to the surface of the table, it's going to put our hand in very close proximity as it passes by the blade. If we hold our push stick so that that notch is firmly against the workpiece, it's going to allow our hand to pass above the saw blade at a safe distance away. When setting the fence, we need to first unlock the handle so we can move it to the desired setting. In setting the fence to the precise measurement, we are going to use the cursor. That is the little red line located in the center of this clear plastic viewer. When you have it at the correct mark or setting, you are going to lock the handle back down. This does not take a lot of force or effort to keep it in the locked position. After locking the handle down, you want to double check your settings to make sure the fence did not move during the locking procedure. The last step in setting the fence is to gently push on the fence to make sure it is securely locked. When pushing materials through the saw, either with the push stick or by hand, we need to push on the piece of material that is between the blade and the fence. Do not push on the material that is on the opposite side of the blade from the fence. When you complete your cut, this would leave a piece of wood stuck between the fence and the blade that could cause kickback. The piece of wood that's on the opposite side of the fence is typically your fall-off piece. This piece is not going to cause problems as it is not going to bind itself between the fence and the blade. So there is a little chance of kickback. When you're cutting, your next piece or your next cut will push the board off the table. Do not use your bare hand to remove this fall-off piece as it is typically closer to the blade than 4 inches away. You would need to use the push stick to move that board away from the blade. Also, do not remove the fall-off piece while the blade is still spinning. You do not want that fall-off piece to accidentally bump into the moving blade. When using the table saw, we want to follow or apply the 4-inch margin of safety, meaning that we keep all fingers and body parts at least 4 inches away from any bits, blades, knives, cutters, or pinch points. We will use the miter tracks on the table saw to give us a visual reference of the 4-inch margin of safety. Our fingers should not be over the miter track when making our cuts. If any part of your hand is over the miter track, then you need to use a push block, a push shoe, or a push stick. On the front side of the blade, our visual reference will be the blade guard. Our hand should be no closer than the very front tip of the guard. This leaves us with a very small area on the table saw. When our hands are in this area, they should not be pushing directly in line with the blade. If our hand slips, it could accidentally go into the blade. When operating the table saw, you should position your body so that you're not in line with the saw blades. A general rule of thumb is to not have your body lined up with the 2 miter tracks or anything in between. If kickback were to occur, that is where the board is going to shoot back. Your left hand should be balled up and planted on the tabletop. Your left hand should never move forward in the operation of the saw. I like to use my index finger to put pressure on the wood so it stays tight against the fence. I use my thumb to put downward pressure on the top surface of the board. The wood is going to slide between the index finger and the thumb. One thing that could happen is you could get a sliver in your index finger or thumb. You will need to wait till after you complete your cut before you worry about the sliver. Remember, you never want to let go of the material when it's between the fence and the blade. Once the back edge of the board has reached your left hand, you will then grab the push stick, or if it's wide enough and you don't need a push stick, then you'll just simply move your left hand out of the way. Remember, your left hand never moves forward. Oftentimes your hand, if it were to move forward, would be moving directly towards the blade. We don't want that to ever happen, so the hand should be planted firm on the table. When using the table saw, your right hand is the hand that is pushing the material through the blade. Your right hand should be at the back edge of the board with your thumb kind of locked over the back edge so that you can grip onto the material. If you just put your hand on the top of the wood and push, it's going to slide across the top surface of the wood, and you're not really going to have any kind of grip to push it forward. You want your fingers spread out so you have more surface area of downward pressure while pushing the board through the saw. As you're pushing forward, you want to slightly turn your wrist clockwise towards the fence. This will help keep the front of the board tight against the fence as you push through the saw. When you're ready to use the saw, you can verify that the machine is ready by looking at the light indicators on the power box. There should be a solid green light on if the saw is ready to use. If no status indicator lights are on, you will need to turn the main power switch on. The main power switch is the red switch with the yellow edge. This switch is typically shut off at the end of each workday. If the status light is solid green and you're ready to start, you're going to use the big red paddle. You're going to pull out on the bottom lip of the paddle to turn the machine on. You'll notice that this paddle is pretty large, So if you get stuck in the middle of a cut and need to stop the machine, you could use your hand and easily hit it, or you could use a knee and bump it to turn it off if needed. When cutting long boards or wide sheets of material, you may find yourself in need of an assistant. Please follow these instructions when you are assisting other people on the saw. On a wide board like this, the operator is going to probably be in this corner over here pushing through, and the support person is going to be over here on the left side of the machine, and they're going to simply be supporting the material up. You're not necessarily grabbing it because you're not pulling it through, you're only supporting it. Okay? The other thing you could do as an assistant is you could help keep the material tight to the fence over on the other side. And as you do that, you're pushing the material tight to the fence, but only in front of the saw blade. Okay, don't do this on the back side of the blade, only the front side. If you're pushing on the back side of the blade, what's going to happen is you're going to pinch that kerf that you've made, or the amount of material that's removed from the saw blade. You're going to pinch the blade with that, and it's likely going to bind the blade and possibly kick back. So again, the only thing you're doing is supporting the material so that it stays flat against the tabletop, and you could push to the fence, but you're only doing that on the front side of the saw blade. If we're cutting a long board at the table saw like this, a couple things we're going to need to consider as we are pushing this through. The long board is going to need some support on the outfeed side. So we might need to have someone here to help support it. You might need to make sure the feed rollers are in place. As that board is getting pushed through the machine, it's going to extend off the table. Now, you need to have someone here to support it if it's really long, and their job is to simply hold the material up. They're not grabbing it because you're not pulling the material through. You're only supporting it so that it stays flat to the tabletop surface. So don't pull it, don't grab it, and don't pull it through the machine. Just supporting the material. Freehand cutting should never be done on the table saw. Freehand cutting is when you make cuts without a straight edge, a fence, a guide, or some sort of jig to keep the wood so that it stays parallel to the blade as you're cutting. When operating the table saw, we need to be focused on the task at hand. When we are running our boards through the machine, about 80% of the time we should be focused or looking at the table saw fence. We want to ensure that the workpiece stays tight against the fence as we are making our cut. The other 20% of the time we should be looking at the saw blade to make sure that we are not cutting into anything that we should not be, like fingers or nails or other foreign objects. So when using the saw, we should be scanning back and forth between the saw blade and the fence. The fence to make sure it stays tight against there, the saw blade to make sure everything looks like it's running okay and we're not hitting anything we shouldn't be. So what do you do if you're in the middle of a cut and something goes wrong? The first thing you want to do is stop pushing the material forward into the blade. But don't let go of the material while the machine is shutting off. After you've stopped pushing the material forward, you're going to use your hand or knee to turn off the machine. But remember, do not let go of the material when you reach down to turn off the machine. Keep your other hand on the material. When you reach over to turn the machine off, or the machine is stopping, make sure to keep the material in one place. Do not move it, because any slight movement could cause it to bind or pinch the blade and cause kickback. You never want to pull the material back towards the operator. So don't try to remove the material from the saw while the blade is spinning. Now let's take a look at what this might look like. I'm going to show you how to make a cut on a narrow piece of material. Getting the board ready, we're going to use our left hand on the side of the board, and remember your left hand does not move forward. Your right hand is pushing it. We get to the edge of the board, we grab the push stick. Now move your left hand out of the way and complete the cut by pushing the material off the table. If you have any questions about this machine, how to operate it, or questions of safe use, please talk to your instructor and get these items resolved so that you feel comfortable and safe using this machine. Now that you have viewed this demonstration, you need to make a time with your instructor when you can demonstrate this machine to your instructor so they understand that you know how to use this machine. This video may not contain all of the safety procedures and practices for this machine. Please refer to and read the owner's manual or operator's manual of this machine before using this machine.